In this video, I will show you top 10 traps against the king's gambit for the black pieces. And you can use these traps against the king's gambit to win more games. So let's move on to our first trap. So after e4, e5, f4, you play d5. This is the fork pair counter gambit. White takes this pawn and then you go c6, offering him another pawn. But instead of taking this pawn, white goes queen e2, trying to take this pawn, but you don't care and play c takes d5. White goes queen takes d5, you block with the bishop, and now white takes your g7 pawn, attacking the rook. But this is a big blunder because you can play bishop to f6. The only safe square for the queen is g3, and then you can play bishop to h4, and his queen is lost. And you are completely winning in just 7 moves. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, d5, white goes knight f3, you play d takes e4, hitting the knight, knight takes e5, you play knight c6, offering exchange of knights, but white goes bishop to b5, pinning your knight to the king. But you ignore this and play knight to f6. And here, white thinks that you made a blunder because after knight takes c6, pawn takes, he can play bishop takes c6 check, poking the king and the rook, and after bishop d7, he thinks that he is completely winning after bishop takes rook. But this is a big mistake because after bishop to g4, his queen is completely trapped. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, you play d5. White takes this pawn and then you play e4. He goes knight c3 attacking the pawn. You play knight f6. White goes d3, offering exchange of pawns, but you ignore this and play bishop b4. Bishop d2, unpinning the knight. And here you play e3, sacrificing this pawn. And after bishop takes e3, you take this pawn, putting more pressure on this knight. Therefore, white goes bishop d2, and here you play bishop takes c3. And here queen to e2 check is not good because after king to d7, white can go queen g4 check. Then you can thus just play king d6. And now this queen is under attack. Therefore, after his queen moves somewhere, you can move the bishop back and he will be off a piece. Therefore, here you have to play bishop takes c3. Then you can just castle here. And after queen d2, preparing to castle, you play rook e8 check, bishop e2, then you go bishop g4, putting more pressure on this bishop. White castle here, and then you can play knight takes c3. He cannot take with the queen because his bishop is hanging, therefore he have to play b takes c3, and now his castle is broken, and after bishop e6, you are completely winning. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, you play d5, e takes d5, and then you go c6, offering him another pawn. White takes this pawn and then you recapture with the knight. And here, white goes c3, trying to play d4 after you take this pawn. And here you go with this tricky move, bishop to d6. And after f takes e5, hitting your bishop, you are going to completely ignore this and play queen to h4 check, g3, and then you can play queen e4 check, poking the king and the rook. And after queen e2, you can take his rook and you are completely winning. Even though here he plays e takes d4, you can just block this check with the bishop and you are completely okay. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, d5, knight f3, you play bishop g4, pinning this knight to the queen. White goes e takes d5, you play e4, attacking the knight. White goes h3, kicking your bishop, but then you can just take this knight with the bishop, and after white recaptures, you play queen h4 check. King e2 is forced, and then you go e takes f3 check. White takes this pawn, and here you play queen to h5 check, which is a skewer, and after king f2, you can take this queen and you're completely winning. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, d5, e takes d5, e4, knight c3, knight h6, white goes bishop to c4. Then you play bishop c5, white goes d4. You capture this pawn also, and then white goes queen take d3. But you just castle here, and after that white plays knight g2, preventing rook e1 check. You play rook e8 anyway, and after bishop d2, preparing to castle, you can play knight g4. Here white goes knight to e4, attacking the bishop. But then you can just play bishop to b5, pinning this knight to the queen. White goes knight to g3, defending his knight. You play knight f2, forking the rook and the queen and also putting pressure on this knight. White goes queen f3, saving his queen. Here, you are not going to capture the rook. Instead, you will play bishop takes e4. And after knight takes e4, you can capture this knight with the rook. And after king f1, you can take his bishop and you are just completely winning. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, d5. Here, white goes f takes e5. This is a big mistake because you can play queen h4 check. And after g3, you can play queen takes e4, forking the king and the rook. And after queen e2, you can take his rook and you are completely winning. And even if here he plays king e2, then you can play queen takes e4 check, king f2, bishop c5 check, d4. You play bishop takes d4, and after king to g3, you can play queen g6 check, queen h4, bishop f2 check, g3. You play queen e4 check, king h5, and then you go g6, king g5 is the only move, and then h6 is a checkmate. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, d5. Here, white goes knight f3. Now you will play d takes e4, knight takes e5. You play bishop d6. White goes bishop c4, hitting f7. But you play knight to h6, defending the threat of f7. Knight c3, normal move, attacking this pawn. Then you castle here. White takes this pawn. And then you go bishop takes e5, and after white recaptures, you can play queen to h4 check, and after knight blocks, you can open up the bishop, you are up a piece and completely winning. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, d5, e takes d5, you play e takes e4. Here, the main move is knight to f3. But here, the second most common move is knight c3. You play queen h4 check, white goes g3, and then you play f takes g3, threatening a discovered check, which is bad for white. Therefore, he goes knight to f3, attacking your queen. But this is a big mistake because you can just play g2 check, and after knight takes your queen, you can play g takes h1 queen, your upper rook, and you are completely winning. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, d5, white goes d4. And here you play e takes e4. Then instead of taking this pawn, white goes e5. You play queen h4 check, king e2. And after that, you can play bishop to g4 check. He blocks with the knight. Then you play knight c6. Bishop takes h4 is a normal move. Here you take this knight with the bishop. If he takes with the pawn, then his bishop is hanging, therefore king is forced to take, defending the bishop. And then you go knight h6. And here, white goes bishop takes h6. But you completely ignore this and play knight takes d4 check, king e3. And then you go bishop to c5. And white is completely lost here. Well, if you want to learn some more chess traps in the King's Gambit, then you can check out this left video. And if you want to learn some chess traps and openings, then you can check out these playlists. And if you don't want to miss more of these videos, then don't forget to subscribe.